Well, good evening. In the old Armour Cemetery in Cape Girardeau on the scenic bluff overlooking the Mississippi River, Judge John Dillard Cook is buried alongside his wife Sarah, their daughter Juliet, their son-in-law, the Reverend Nelson Henry, and other members of the family. John Dillard Cook was one of the most prominent and fascinating characters in all of southeast Missouri during the antebellum period. He was, as some of you know, one of the first 3 judges of the Supreme Court of Missouri at statehood in 1821, but that's only a very small part of his story. You see, his experience as a pioneer judge was shared by most of the other pioneer judges from statehood on, and with the exception that his experience was probably more high profile than most of the others. John Dillard Cook was born in Orange County, Virginia in 1789 to a family of farmers, or planters as they called themselves. When he was 7 or 8 years old, his family moved to the area around Frankfort, Kentucky, and there he grew into manhood and received his education. He decided to become a lawyer, and so he read law. Back in those days, most lawyers did not go to a law school to have formal training. It just wasn't available. And so one was said to read law, or to have read law, with a well-established, well-known, well-respected lawyer in the community. And so that was the case with John Dillard Cook. He read law for 2 years. It was a kind of an apprenticeship. And after a couple of years, the practice was you could then go before one of the circuit judges or the district judges in the area and take a bar exam. And so sure enough, John Dillard Cook passed the bar exam. In 1814, he also married to Sarah. Within a year or so, they moved to St. Genevieve. This was right at the end of the War of 1812, and there was a huge influx of immigrants from all of those areas in Kentucky and Tennessee and the Carolinas and Virginia and so forth. So he was part of that migration. As a lawyer, he was immediately prosperous. One commentator said they only counted maybe a dozen lawyers in the entire Missouri territory at the time. So here's another lawyer coming in, ambitious. So he started to practice, he began to raise his family, and he began also to dabble in politics. He was successful enough that by 1818 he was elected to the territorial Council of Missouri as a territorial senator. That was the equivalent of what a state senator is now. Mind you, he was only 28 years old at the time. He continued that success, and in 1820, when on the verge of statehood, it was determined that there had to be a vote to elect members to draft a constitution. And so he got himself elected again as a delegate to the Missouri Constitutional Convention of 1820. By then he was only 30 years old, but very successful. The reason that some commentators say that he was able to have such a rise in his profession and politically was that he had a genial wit, he had a pleasing personality, and above all, he had an uncommon fund of common sense. So there were 41 delegates who were elected. He was elected from St. Genevieve. The votes for the delegates were 7-1, 8-1, 9-1 in favor of delegates who were against restrictions on slavery. So there was one delegate, for instance, from Cape Girardeau County. He came in dead last out of about 9 candidates. His name was George Scripps, and he was against slavery. It wouldn't fly back then. The state was overwhelmingly pro-slavery at the time. That's really not the right description. They were against restrictions on slavery. There's a difference of sorts. They all recognized the evil, or most of them did. But even more so than being against restrictions on slavery, they were against they were anti-federal government. They did not like the federal government to tell them what to do. Our State Historical Society director, Gary Kramer, has a stock speech on the bicentennial, and he says that, he professes that Missouri, there was a big faction in Missouri, in the Missouri Territory, who tried to secede from the United States even before it became a state, because of that very problem. They didn't want the federal government telling them what to do. So there were 9 lawyers on the Constitutional Convention out of 41, and as lawyers with their special skills, they had an outsized influence and an outsized participation. Especially so with John Dillard Cook. The historians say that he was one of the 6 principal authors of the Missouri Constitution of 1820, and the preeminent Missouri scholar Floyd Shoemaker called him one of the fathers of the Missouri Constitution. The Constitution was adopted June 19th, 1820, but of course we didn't achieve formal statehood until August 10th of 1821 because of continuing concerns about the existence of slavery in Missouri. Now, Cook's special assignment was to be one of 3 people on the Constitutional Convention to draft the judicial article to establish the judicial power in Missouri, and that was Article 5. So the way it was set up, there were 4 districts, 4 judicial districts originally constituted by virtue of this provision in the Constitution. Now there are 46 circuits, but back then there were just 4. The courts were to meet 2 sessions annually. There was provision for a Supreme Court of 3 judges and circuit judges in each of those districts. So another provision was that the governor would appoint all the judges, the Supreme Court judges and the circuit judges, subject to the advice and consent of the Missouri State Senate. Very similar to the way the United States selection of judges still is today. Presidential appointment subject to the advice and consent of the United States Senate. That's the way we had it set up originally. The only restrictions were that the judges had to be at least 30 years old and there was mandatory retirement at age 65. And they would hold office only during good behavior. So, now, John Dillard Cook also plugged in another quite controversial provision in the Constitution of 1820. He said, or he wrote, that the compensation for Supreme Court judges should be not less than $2,000 annually. That was a handsome sum at the time. It caused quite a bit of outrage, and one of the first amendments to the Constitution was to repeal that provision and have the legislature set salaries for judges, and certainly within the minimum time, the salary was reduced to $1,400 from $2,000. Let me step aside for a minute and tell you about John Dillard Cook's family, especially his 2 brothers. His oldest brother was Nathaniel Cook. He came over 15 years before John Dillard Cook came. He was part of a different migration, not the one that showed up in Cape in 1800, but he came over also with a group from Kentucky about 1800, and he made his way over to what's now Farmington, and he established what was called then the Cook Settlement, now Farmington, Missouri. He had quite a career already. He had been an Indian fighter in Kentucky for a while. He quickly became, or got an appointment as the Deputy Government Land Surveyor, and you can imagine how he was able to parlay that position in real estate. So, in any event, over the years he migrated down to what's now in Madison County. He obtained the 40 acres that is now the heart of downtown Fredericktown, Missouri, and he deeded that over to establish the city of Fredericktown. So he spent his final years there. Now, he was also elected to the Territorial Senate in 1816, 2 years before his brother John Dillard Cook. And there's no wonder, because he had just finished a time in the War of 1812. He was a combat veteran of the War of 1812, rose to the rank of brigadier general and commanded a regiment in combat during the war. So he was quite a well-known figure and well-respected figure, and he became wealthy. He was a wealthy person and much older than his younger sibling. He too then was elected to the Constitutional Convention of 1820, side by side with his brother John Dillard Cook. Later, right after the adoption of the Constitution, he ran for both lieutenant governor and for U.S. senator, got beat both times. But he was fine, he was a wealthy man and lived out his years. Now, the other brother that I'll mention was the middle brother. His name was Daniel Pope Cook. He too was a lawyer, and he had that kind of an affable disposition like John Dillard Cook, and he didn't make it over to Missouri. He established his practice in Kaskaskia, right across the river from St. Genevieve. And he was very successful too. He came over about the same time, maybe a year or two before John Dillard Cook, settled in Kaskaskia, was very successful in his practice, so much so, and he became so prominent in such a short time, that when Illinois became a state in 1818, Daniel Pope Cook was elected the first member of Congress from the new state of Illinois in 1818. I didn't realize it, but Kaskaskia was the first state capital of Illinois. In any event, Daniel Pope Cook had all sorts of accolades. He died young at age 33, but one thing I found very interesting. During the debates in Congress, on the floor of the House of Representatives, he blasted Missouri's effort in 1820 to get into the Union as a slave state, even calling out his own family, his two brothers and their sisters were over. Called them out in no uncertain terms as scoundrels. Now, you know about that Cook brother because you know about Cook County, Illinois. Chicago, named after Daniel Pope Cook, John Dillard Cook's middle brother, okay? Now, let's go back to the Constitutional Convention. There were spoils to having served as a delegate to the convention, and one of those spoils for the lawyer types was three of them got appointed to the Supreme Court. One was John Rice Jones. Now, he had been a settler earlier on, right after the Louisiana Purchase, and he was a wealthy man too. He was 20 years older than the other two, and he was a law school educated lawyer, very prominent, very well respected. So he was one of the first judges. He died, though, just 3 years later after 1821 and in 1824. Now, the other two were John D. Cook. He was just 31 years old when he was appointed, and another 31-year-old appointee to the Supreme Court by the first governor, Alexander McNair, was a guy with a fabulous name of Matthias McGurk. And so he served for 20 years. He was from Montgomery County, and he served for 20 years, all that time. He was the first Chief Justice and had a marvelous career and very well respected as well. Now, John Dillard Cook served only 2.5 years. For some reason, he didn't take to the job. And there's all sorts of speculation from historians about why he quit. Most people think that he just liked a bucolic lifestyle. He liked the pleasant aspects of country life. He wasn't a city slicker by any means. He liked nature and the woods and the outdoors, and he didn't like the chores of being on the Supreme Court, apparently. Now, this had nothing to do with his ability. The commentator said he had ability and poise and elegance of diction. By all accounts, he was a very competent and well-respected judge on the Supreme Court. There was one case that I might mention, the most important of his 26 opinions that he wrote in that 2.5-year period. It was the case of Bailey versus Gentry. It was a replevin case. Now, for you non-lawyers, replevin is a lawsuit that is brought by a person who seeks to reobtain his or her property that has been obtained unlawfully by someone else. And so you bring a suit in replevin to get your property back. So there was a challenge to the constitutionality of this brand new statute, the replevin statute in Missouri, and the judges on the Supreme Court declared the law unconstitutional. Well, the significance of that was not so much about the replevin action or why it was unconstitutional, but this was the first case in which the Missouri Supreme Court adopted the doctrine of judicial review, which means that the court has inherent power to determine whether a law passed by the legislature or Congress on the national level is constitutional or not. So, as an aside, the interesting but sad object of the replevin action was a slave. So, John Dillard Cook resigns from the Supreme Court. He makes his way to Cape Girardeau County, sets up a law practice here in Jackson. He's very successful once again. He runs for state rep, gets beat, but that's okay. His law practice is booming. His family's going great. In 1924, let me change that. In 1924, Judge Richard S. Thomas was impeached. He was the first of the circuit judges here in this area. He also was a member of the Constitutional Convention of 1820, and that was his spoils to be appointed as the circuit judge down here. Well, Richard Thomas got himself impeached, and he was removed from office in 1825. I have a book here called Reminiscences of the Bench and Bar of Missouri, and it's a wonderful book full of anecdotes and many biographies of the old pioneer judges. It's written by a fellow who was a state court judge himself in 1878. I've got a slick back reprint, but I've seen the original book too. So he was writing from with the memories of all the pioneer judges who had gone before him. This is, and the way they would write back then, they would write in the most unflattering terms sometimes, even pointed out personal appearance, and it's not an uncommon practice of writers at the time. Mary Beth, for instance, are much more calm about your writing style than these people were back then. And it went, the writers were effusive and they embellished things for good and for bad. But here's what they said about poor Judge Richard Thomas. He was a large, portly man with pompous and disagreeable manners, which made him exceedingly unpopular with the bar and the people. And in addition to this, he was overbearing and tyrannical, and seemed to take particular pains to make himself obnoxious to suitors, witnesses, and all others who attended his court. It didn't help, too, that he appointed his own son as the clerk of the court. And so he was removed in 1825, early in 1825, to the surprise of many. John Dillard Cook, who'd been on the highest court in the state, the Supreme Court, accepted an appointment to fill Judge Thomas's shoes as the circuit judge here. So for the next 24 years, Judge John Dillard Cook rode the circuit that encompassed literally all of southeast Missouri at the time, and you can imagine it was still a lot of wilderness. The circuit was just one great big blob initially, but as the state grew, population grew, new counties were established, the new circuits were established as well. So what did it mean to ride the circuit? Well, as you would expect, the circuit judge would ride from county seat to county seat, holding court first in taverns or maybe even private homes, eventually in rudimentary log cabins, and finally in more sophisticated buildings. They'd hold court for several days, sometimes a week or two. There was always an entourage with the judge, sometimes a court clerk or court reporter, but more importantly, there were always a passel of lawyers who were accompanying the judge on horseback, riding the circuit. And those were the lawyers who had filed cases or were defending cases in those counties where the cases were to be disposed of or tried or pled or otherwise disposed of. So the lawyers also, when they would come to these county seats, they'd sign up new clients whose cases could be tried at the next terms of court on the circuit. So they always traveled by horseback. The judge and the lawyers would put up in inns and taverns or private homes, sometimes sleeping two to a bed, with the exception of the judge, who of course presumably slept alone. Perhaps you've heard of this practice from reading about Abraham Lincoln, who practiced law in that same fashion as a country lawyer riding the frontier circuit in Illinois. In any event, the docket of civil cases back then was mainly collection cases, the cases for the collection of debts. There was no really established banking system at the time, so debts were really from person to person ordinarily. And there were variations on that. There were foreclosure proceedings, which were based on debts. There were suits over title to property. Those were the main kinds of cases back then. There were no antitrust cases or complicated things like that. And then, of course, there were criminal cases too, felony criminal cases, and there was always an attorney, a prosecuting attorney traveling as part of the entourage and handling both civil and criminal cases. Now, John Dillard Cook was the most prominent judge in all of Southeast Missouri, and maybe in the whole state, except for Matthias McGurk, for many years. But the most prominent lawyer over those years of the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and even 50s was a fellow named Greer Davis. Greer Davis came to Jackson in 1820. He practiced here until he died in 1878. At the age of 79, he was the oldest licensed lawyer in Missouri at the time. He was so prominent and so well thought of that he was called the father of the Missouri bar. Let me take a little excerpt from the Reminiscences book on the good side, not the bad side. Here's what the remembrance is of just a very small part of several pages about Greer Cook from Jackson. He was always a very successful lawyer, for in addition to his thorough knowledge of the law, he carried with him the most exalted character for honesty and integrity. For nothing did he despise more than trickery or low cunning. No one can say that he was ever guilty of a mean act to win a cause or accomplish an end. He was, moreover, one of the most kind-hearted and benevolent of men, always ready to give to the poor and needy, and cheerfully responding to every call of deserved charity. This is in contrast to the former judge, the impeached judge, Richard Thomas. Well, John Dillard Cook's best friend was the lawyer Greer Davis. They were so close that John Dillard Cook named his own son Greer Cook. For 17 years of Judge John Cook's tenure on the circuit, Greer Cook was the prosecuting attorney. And he would travel on these circuits and he would prosecute the cases. So I pity the poor defense lawyer who had to try a case where Greer W. Davis was the prosecutor and John Dillard Cook was the judge. Not much of a chance to win that case. So it was that for nearly 24 years, John Dillard Cook rode his circuit from the county seats. He rode it to Perryville, he rode it to Marble Hill, Dallas at the time, he rode it to Jackson, he rode it to St. Genevieve. Later on, as new circuits were established, and he was the one who did it. He rode to Stoddard County in 1836 and to Dunklin County and Mississippi County in 1844, all as the circuit judge for this area. So now you know why we call our own state judges circuit judges. And to this day, our circuit judges ride the circuit from Jackson to Marble Hill to Perryville, the 3 county seats within the 32nd Judicial Circuit. I myself am a direct judicial descendant of John Dillard Cook, having served as a circuit judge back in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Now, I do have one little anecdote I might share with you about his service. This is taken from his service down in Stoddard County, starting in 1836. This is taken from the history of the Stoddard County Circuit Court. It's what they said in part. As a lawyer, he ranked high, his decisions as a trial court being seldom reversed on appeal. An ardent fisherman he is reputed to have been, and there is a tradition to the effect that if the sign was right, and the weather and season inviting, the call of the wild would sometimes so thoroughly master him that he could not refrain from playing hooky from the bench and steal away with hook and line for an afternoon sport. Thank goodness there weren't any golf courses back then. All the while of the 24 years that he was the circuit judge, John Dillard Cook engaged in a multitude of civic and church and charitable activities. They involved politics as well. He was much involved in politics. This was before judges, according to judicial ethics, were prohibited from engaging in political activities. So with no prohibition, that's what he did. I found excerpts from the newspapers in the 20s and 30s and 40s, 1820s, 30s, 40s, with occasional references of what he was doing politically. For instance, in 1828, he gave a speech endorsing John Quincy Adams for President of the United States against the evil Democrat Andrew Jackson. Then in 1830, I found another article where he, at a political meeting in Cape Girardeau, he ostracized and opposed with great venom the famous Democrat senator from Missouri, Thomas Hart Benton. Now, in the late 1830s, the two dominant parties in Missouri and most of the country were the Democrats, led by Andrew Jackson, and the Whigs. The Whigs arose nationally in the early 1830s, and they continued with some steam through the early to mid 1850s. Nearly all of those Whigs eventually became Republicans. Abraham Lincoln was a good example. He was a Whig for many, many years, and by the mid-50s, he turned into a Republican. John Dillard Cook was a Whig until he died, because he died earlier in 1853. Now, the big difference between the Whigs and the Democrats is the Democrats in general are bought into the idea of manifest destiny, and they encouraged territorial expansion. The Whigs, on the other hand, were terribly frightened about territorial expansion because they thought the issue of slavery would then tear the nation apart, which proved true eventually. The Whigs generally were against the expansion of slavery. Then as now, the nation was all stewed up over race relations. At the 1820 convention, as I mentioned, near unanimity among the delegates that Missouri needed to be admitted as a slave state, or rather as a state without restrictions on slavery. So yes, John Dillard Cook was a slaveholder, at least at one time. And the census of 1830 is shown to have had 2 slaves. Now, these were probably household slaves who had a better time of it than slaves who were outdoor plantation slaves. Cook never had any kind of slaves that would have been subject to that kind of work. And in fact, there were just a few of the larger slaveholder families in this area that really could be called large plantation-style slave owners. However, by the census of 1840 and the census of 1850, John Cook reported no slaves. He had obviously divested himself due to moral and religious beliefs. There was throughout the country an increasing moral opposition to slavery, but the question is what to do about it. Most everyone agreed that slavery would eventually die out, but what was the alternative to emancipation? So the Whigs came up with this idea. This was the principal remedy for it, and a lot of Democrats joined in too, and that was to address the Negro problem, to propose to send free blacks back to Africa. In fact, most people looked on that idea favorably, except the abolitionists, which were still on the fringe. This was seen as a humane and righteous disposition. So the American Colonization Society was established back in 1817. It reached its zenith in 1847 with the formal establishment of the West African coast country of Liberia. Even the progressive Whigs, though, did not support the abolition of slavery, and nor were they willing to consider blacks as equals. So here we have this American Colonization Society that was truly overtly racist, yet relatively progressive, all things considered. Now, the American colonization ceremony was so widespread that there were auxiliary societies, chapters in every state. St. Louis had a chapter, several throughout Missouri. Cape Girardeau County had a chapter. I've located the records in the State Historical Society records, and sure enough, in 1833, our man John Dillard Cook was president of the American Colonization Society in Cape Girardeau County. Now, don't think of him so badly. 4 of the vice presidents were preachers, Methodist preachers, Presbyterian preachers, Baptist preachers. And sure enough, the secretary was Greer Cook, his best friend. For all his involvement in politics and the American Colonization Society, first and foremost, John Dillard Cook was a Methodist. Is there anyone who has not been to Old McKendree Chapel? If so, raise your hand. Shame. Shame. McKendree Chapel is the oldest Protestant church still standing west of the Mississippi River. It is a holy and sacred place to this day.
We'll go, I promise.
Raise your right hand. Anyway, Cook was a member, and his family was a member of the congregation at the old McKendree Chapel. It was the epicenter of Methodism since it was built and consecrated in 1819. And so it was the epicenter of Methodism for 20 or so years, and Cook was a trustee on all the deeds for Old McKendree. But he was also a trustee to the Methodist churches in Jackson proper, in Cape City, and in other churches in the outlying area. So obviously somebody like him was going to be a leader within the Methodist Church. And so he and Greer Davis both were. The story of Methodism and slavery mirrored the debate across the nation, with this exception. Slavery and Methodism came to a head 17 years before the Civil War. The Methodist Church split over slavery 17 years before the beginning of the Civil War. It was a precursor to the Civil War. Slavery was always a theological thorn to the Methodists. Slavery was an affront to Christian principles. Methodist preachers were banned from owning slaves. This was such an ingrained part of Methodist theology that the early circuit riders in 1819, when McKendree Chapel was built and when Missouri was being considered for statehood, they carried petitions throughout the state trying to get people to sign up so that to oppose Missouri's admission as a slave state and bring it in as a free state. Now, I hate to pick on the Baptists and the others again, but the other preachers were not banned from owning slaves. Father Pareo, the head of the St. Vincent's Seminary, the Catholic Church, he owned 10 slaves. Pastor Clark, the leading pastor of the Baptist Church, that's okay. Pastor Clark, the Baptist preacher, owned 16 slaves. How can that be? Well, for the Methodists, as a practicality, it was just untenable to deny membership to people who were slave owners. So they let slave owners into the Methodist Church. So the situation here in Missouri and Cape Girardeau itself was a microcosm of the larger situation with the Methodists. Here's how it came to a head in 1844. There was a Methodist bishop called James Andrew. He was head of the church in Georgia, the Methodist Episcopal Church in Georgia. He came into slave ownership through inheritance and through his wife's family. Now, he found himself in a terrible predicament because the Methodist Church forbade its pastors from owning slaves. The state of Georgia forbade people from fleeing your slaves. They call it anti-manumission statute. So what is he to do? What a pickle he's in. He wanted to free the slaves, but he couldn't do it. It was against the law. So the southern states just rebelled completely when the northern states and the Methodist Episcopal Church ordered, and the Methodist Conference in general, ordered Bishop Andrew to step down. That caused the split in the Methodist Church so that all the southern states, every one of them that eventually left during the Civil War, and other states too, like Missouri, they all voted to establish a separate but related denomination called the Methodist Episcopal Church South. There was a plan of separation. The finalized document was in a conference in Louisville Kentucky in May of 1945. The Missouri delegation voted 94-3 to go with the South Church. Then when the actual churches voted that October 1845, for all the churches within the Conference of Missouri, they voted separately what they would do. The vote at that time was 86-14 to go south. Nelson Henry, the preacher at Old McKendree, and the son-in-law of John Dillard Cook, was one of the 14 to stay north. As it turned out, only a very small handful of churches in Missouri stayed north, and the only way they were able to do it was because the plan of separation provided that there would be a local option for churches and church districts that bordered a free state. They could go south with the majority, or they could stay north as independents, but still with the Methodist Episcopal Church north. This is the way it played out at Old McKendree Chapel. And this was a year before, right about this time in September of 1844, in anticipation that this split was going to occur, just as it did by those massive votes. And so the congregation at Old McKendree met to work this out. And the preacher Nelson Henry, as the old-timers recalled, with a time of heartbreak, at one Sunday service he set up two benches, two mourners' benches, one for the north and one for the south. And then he called for the mourners. Just as in the Civil War, even families split up. That church split up, families split up within the church. Some went south, a good many stayed with the North Church. John Dillard Cook and his family stayed with the North Church, with the anti-slavery North Church, and found themselves on the right side of history. It wasn't until 1939 that the Methodist Church, North and South, reconciled. But the reason I bring this up, and the reason it's important as part of bicentennial Missouri, is because the Methodists were a big deal. And no more prominent Methodist existed than John Dillard Cook and his friend Greer Davis. You see, the Methodist Church, on the eve of the Civil War in 1860, was the largest, the combined North and South Methodist Church was the largest non-governmental organization in the United States. It was the largest religious denomination. One survey had the Methodists at 6 million, the Baptists at 4 million, and the Presbyterians and the Roman Catholics well behind. 1/3 of all people who engaged in organized religion counted themselves as Methodists. And so the proponents and the opponents of every cultural and political issue of the day sought the favor of the Methodists. That's why it's important to know that John Dillard Cook had that background. Now, this is more in the nature of another aside. The second most important issue other than slavery was drinking. There was an acute need for temperance in a liquor-loving populace. My grandmother, back in the 20s, the 1920s, was WCTU, Women's Christian Temperance Union, during Prohibition. Back in the 1800s, 80 years, 90 years before, they had a separate organization for the men. It was called the Sons of Temperance. And there were two chapters, one in Jackson and one in Cape Girardeau. Cape Girardeau was called the Marble City Division, and Jackson was called the Olive Branch Division. I found a great article from the Western Eagle from July 7th, 1848, reporting the events of the 4th of July. So all the Sons of Temperance, they threw a big parade. They started at the Baptist Church on Larmer Street, across from the courthouse. They had a big sermons and singing, and then they had a parade down Broadway to Main Street where they had a grand dinner and more sermons and singings and rejoicing. And the report in the paper was this: it was all calculated to encourage the sons in their benevolent exertions to save their fellow beings from ruin. So the results of these and subsequent efforts were not altogether fruitful, of course. But surely some small gain was made in the general civility of the county. And yes, John Dillard Cook and Greer Davis, they were officers of the Sons of Temperance, as expected. I have to say, though, there's conflicting evidence about Judge Cook's status as a teetotaler. I'll get to that in a minute. So in 1848, that was also the year that Judge Cook tired of riding the circuit. He was 58 years old by then. What a struggle. He decided, though, to dabble back in politics. He was a Whig and a prominent Whig, the most prominent Whig in all of southeast Missouri. He was elected by acclamation to be the Whig Party's candidate for election to the congressional district, which then included most of southeast Missouri, all the way up to the St. Louis area. The local paper, the Western Advocate, was a Whig paper and was hugely supportive of John Dillard Cook's candidacy, writing editorials most every week to support him. Alas, the election came. He was soundly defeated by a 60-40 percentage, even in Cape Girardeau County. You see, his opponent was the incumbent Democrat in a pro-slavery district. And surely there were some who remembered how John Cook and his family stayed with the North Church, the anti-slavery North Church. So he is soundly defeated for Congress in 1848. But not to worry. At the November election, one General Zachary Taylor, the Whig candidate, was elected President of the United States. Within a few months, President Zachary Taylor appointed John Dillard Cook to be the United States Attorney for the entire state of Missouri. I know it was just a small coincidence that Judge Cook's wife, Sarah Taylor Cook, was the first cousin to the new president, Zachary Taylor. But in any event, for the next 4 years, he served as the United States Attorney for the entire federal district of the state of Missouri. He was the chief federal law enforcement officer for the state of Missouri during that time. Mostly in bad health during the last 2 years. Just a couple of things I found out about his tenure as 4-year tenure as the United States Attorney. That was in 1851, there was an article that there's not much follow-up to it, that John Cook's nephew, the son of Nathaniel Cook, was brutally murdered in the boot heel. Now, we can't find evidence of what happened in the case, but it was a strange happening. And as the federal prosecutor, he could have been involved in that investigation or prosecution. That's research for another day. Another thing I found out was a newspaper article from St. Louis in 1851. And this burnished John Dillard Cook's credentials as an anti-slavery advocate, because he was hired by the AME Church in St. Louis, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the African American branch of the Methodist Episcopal Church, to represent them to replevy, or to secure back property that they said had been unlawfully taken from the AME Church during the plan of separation in 1845. The case didn't get disposed of until after John Cook died in 1853. When he died in October of, 1852, the tributes started to pour in. His obituary was published all throughout Missouri, in St. Louis and Jefferson City and elsewhere, but also throughout the whole country. We found obituaries for John Dillard Cook in Vicksburg and Nashville in New Orleans and Washington, D.C. and New York. This is what the St. Louis, Missouri Republican newspaper reported on his death. Judge Cook enjoyed the entire confidence of the bar and of the circuit in which he presided. He was a sound lawyer and an upright judge. Few men have passed from the stage of action leaving a less number of enemies than John D. Cook. Well, then I'm going to skip over to the reminiscences of this guy writing in 1878 in rather unflattering terms. You see, it turns out that Judge Cook was something of a character, too. Despite his piousness, his church-going, his uprightness, and his excellence in the law, this is what our author had to say about him, writing in 1878. Judge Cook was a member of the convention which framed our original state constitution, and we are indebted to him for some of its best provisions. And he was a thorough lawyer and understood the common law of England as well as any divine ever understood the Ten Commandments. But then he honed in on the downside. He said, all he wanted to make him the peer of any Western lawyer was industry and energy, in both of which he was greatly wanting. He loved his ease and comfort. Then it goes on. He was not versed in the classics, but was a fine English scholar, well posted in English literature. Judge Cook was addicted to no bad habits, unless laziness is one. He had fine conversational powers, was genial, pleasant, and full of anecdote, and could entertain one by the hour in the recital of them. That summary, the writer then added this: Judge Cook was an extremely ugly-looking man, and what is strange, seemed to regard his repulsive looks as a fortunate gift. And this was followed by a story, a hilarious tale of Judge Cook's encounter with one Judge Wright of Ohio, both of whom were aboard a steamer headed for St. Louis to a meeting. As it turns out, at first Judge Wright struck one of the other passengers as being an uglier man than Cook. Wages were then taken by the passengers, with each judge claiming the honor of being the ugliest. And thereupon they all proceeded to the bar, and over several bottles of champagne, drank to each other's health, and it was held, without a dissenting opinion, after due deliberation, that two uglier men were never born of women, and that they should be adjudged to pay the costs. So, you know, we have quite a few direct descendants of Judge Cook here in Cape Girardeau County. I'm pleased to acknowledge that over the generations, they have become quite handsome people. Now, what I have here is a portrait of Judge Cook that is blown up from the portrait that is down, donated by descendants of Judge Cook. It's down at the River Heritage Museum in Cape. This is actually a copy of the formal portrait that was commissioned in 1930 to commemorate Judge Cook's service as one of the pioneer judges on the court. That original portrait is in the conference room at the Missouri Supreme Court. Now notice his fair features and his attractive countenance. This, my friends, is what's known as revisionist history. Fake news. This is Judge Cook. This, you see, is an original daguerreotype from when he actually lived. The formal portrait was made 75, 77 years after he died. Nobody knew what he looked like. But the people who commissioned that fine portrait, they didn't find this. This is set out in Volume 3 of Lewis Houck's History of Missouri, published 22 years before. Well, in any event, whatever his looks, his fine reputation was eventually reestablished, also in 1930 in connection with the ceremony where they rolled out the other portrait and celebrated his service. This is from the Missouri Reports of the Supreme Court from 1930, and I'll just end with this. It says, after life's fitful fever, John Dillard Cook's body has slept well for more than 3/4 of a century. But his soul goes marching on, and the gentle effulgence, I had to look it up too. It means brilliant radiance. But his soul goes marching on, and the gentle effulgence that emanates from his splendid character grows brighter and brighter as the years go by. So that, my friends, is an abbreviated version of the life and times of John Dillard Cook. I'll take questions if you want. Yeah.